I think there's a few classes here. I'm not sure, but like Eric Schutz's class, Chris Kelly, Bob Reinhardt. But our speaker today is Dr. Richard Wolff, Professor, I guess, Emeritus from the University of Massachusetts. Has been working a long time on various aspects of economic theory. And he's here to give you a presentation on poverty and, I think, a radical and Marxian approach. And afterwards.
So thank you very much for coming, if you had choice in it. I'm going to try to do three things in a short amount of time. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of poverty in the world. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about how different ways of thinking about economics, different theories, approach this question. And that maybe will help us explain why the poverty that people started worrying about hundreds of years ago remains the problem that people are continuing to worry about. So let me start with that last point. The ability of modern capitalist societies, the kinds of societies we've had for the last 200-300 years, to get rid of poverty in the world is a record of stunning failure. The gap between rich and poor, which is what I mean by poverty, the range of difference, not so much the absolute level at which people live, although that's not a happy story either, but the relative, the gap between rich and poor that has bothered sensitive people for a great long time, continues to bother them now. So one of the first things to think about when thinking about poverty is why it is, as somebody wrote a long time ago, always with us, and what might explain that, and what might be done to deal with that. The vast majority of the people in the world worry about this problem every day because they live in that problem every day. That might be a little hard for some of you, given where we sit right now, but for most of the people in the world, poverty is, if not the #1 issue, real close to the #1 issue. Here in the United States, it's really poignant. The gap between rich and poor has been growing spectacularly over the last 30 years, so that we are now coming back in the United States to the way it was a century ago. In between, we had a narrowing. 40 years ago, the United States had less poverty relative to wealth than most of the other advanced industrial countries, say in Europe, places like France, or Germany, or Italy, or England. We are now the most unequal of all. Not a happy thought, but it's a problem, clearly. We have a lot of poverty. The poverty is not going away. It's true that some countries that used to be spectacularly poor are not quite so far behind us. India and China come to mind. But even there, the problem, the minute you look a little more closely, is terrible, because while they as a society are not as far behind standards of living as the United States, inside their countries, the gap between rich and poor has actually gotten worse. So that this problem of poverty seems to be a problem that Western society, and indeed those countries that are like copying Western economic systems, are having one hell of a hard time dealing with. Last point, to make it clear that it's a serious problem. Many of you probably paid some attention a few weeks ago to dramatic events in places like Tunisia and Egypt, or these days in Libya and Bahrain. A great deal of what's going on in those countries, despite what you see on television, is not so much about freedom and democracy as it is about not wanting to be as horrifically poor as the vast majority of people in those societies are. They can't stand it anymore. The gap between themselves and the rich is no longer tolerable. If the widening gap between rich and poor in other countries produces serious social conflict, I'll leave it to you all to think about what might be in the future for you as Americans in a society that is doing exactly the same thing, widening the gap between the rich and the poor. How have different ways of thinking about economics dealt with this? Well, the two major ways that people have thought about economics in the Western part of this world, the last 100 or 200 years. Our first, the kind of main one, once upon a time was called classical political economy. Now it's called neoclassical. It's a kind of way of thinking that focuses on individuals and what individuals like and don't like, their preferences, and how they act in the market to buy and sell things. So it should come to you as no surprise, since these folks love markets and think they're wonderful engines of economic progress, and how individuals determine how the world works, so the life you lead is a product of your individual capabilities. You won't be surprised that that kind of theory thinks that the way to solve poverty problems is to let the market do its work. Free markets up. Don't hinder them. They like, for example, to pick things that hinder markets, I don't know, like the minimum wage law. Government says you can't pay people less than a certain amount. And these folks believe you shouldn't have that. Because if you have to pay them a certain amount and you're not going to make money by doing so, then you're not going to hire them. They're going to be unemployed and poor. And so the solution is let their wages go down, because then someone can make money off of them, will hire them, and they won't be quite so poor as they would have been without the job. It sounds to you like a bit of tortured reasoning. Well, it is the dominant paradigm. So it thinks the way you overcome poverty is let markets do their work, and the other thing it thinks is make people more productive. Give them a better education, or more education, or some skills, or more skills, and then they'll do better. This theory obviously believes that the amount of money you earn in a society is a function of how productive you are. You get what you deserve, which is a hallmark of that theory. And so people who've been upset about poverty and believe that theory, and there are plenty of those, have advocated beefing up people's education, getting the government out of interfering in the market, and hoping that somehow the market and private enterprise and the profit motive will lead businesses to take the steps that will get rid of poverty. That's been a dominant approach to poverty for about as long as poverty has resisted any successful process of overcoming it. A reasonable person would have good grounds for doubting the efficacy of that particular approach to economics to solving that particular problem. But if you believe enough in the theory, the fact that it doesn't solve the problem is not going to dissuade you, and so lots of people have managed to hold on to the theory, even those who think that poverty is an important social problem. They just think maybe we need more training of people, more freedom of the market, and maybe we'll get the problem solved. Then there are a different group of people who see economics differently. They don't think it's shaped by what individuals want all that much. And they're not so taken with the market. They think the market screws up as often as it does things right, to say the least. And these people want the government to come in and take an active role in making things work out, make the economy work better than it otherwise would if you left it to the private enterprises and markets. If I'd been giving this talk a few years ago, I would have to explain this theory, because most young folks in those days, not at a place like Rollins, I'm happy to say, but in most places where economics is taught, young people would have thought that the government everybody understood is the last thing in the world we want to have interfere in our economy, and the economy will work really well if the government stays out of it. Here we are now, however, in the third year, depending on how you count, of a major economic collapse of our free enterprise market system, and we would have collapsed much worse, and we would be in much worse shape now were it not for the overwhelming support provided to this economy by the United States government. Some of you may not know, for example, that one of the most important parts of our economy today is the housing market, everything having to do with building houses, furnishing houses, provisioning people in houses. Housing market's crucial. All houses are, all but a handful, are bought by mortgages. That's when people go and borrow from a bank to be able to afford a house. The overwhelming majority of people couldn't possibly buy a house any other way. Last year, just to give you an example, the United States government either bought or guaranteed 98% of all mortgages written by all lenders to the American people. No government support, no housing market. And if you and your parents have had a conversation about the decrease in the value of the homes you live in, If the government weren't there supporting you, you'd be talking about a much bigger drop than you already do. The government has been propping up the American economy for the last 3.5 years in so massive a way that the idea that we can dispense with the government intervening in our economy is an idea that needs a real heroic commitment to hold on. Fortunately, a significant number of my colleagues have that level of commitment, and they're trying to hold on. So the government should come in, say these people. Sometimes they go by names like Keynesians, because they're famous British economists who wrote all this down. And they think the government can come in and deal with the problem of poverty. The government should come in, do all kinds of things. Particularly, the government should stimulate the economy, buy things, cut taxes, so that other people can buy things. And then we'll finally get the employment that will put people to work, and then we won't have the poverty. They've been trying that for a long time, too. That doesn't have a whole hell of a lot better record than the first group. A half century ago, 1960 to be exact, a famous American social theorist named Michael Harrington wrote a famous book called The Other America. And in that, he taught to the readers of that book, that was a long time ago when people read books. And he wrote in this book, and people read it, that alongside the America we pretended was America, there was this other America that had millions and millions and millions of people that we as a culture pretend aren't there. Or if we admit they're there, we tell ourselves really fantastic stories about how they live, sort of like us, just a little less well off. And he explained in that book, and it was a tremendous hit, that those people really have a rough time and that there's a whole other America that's really poor. Every 10 years after that, somebody else made a good reputation and sold a lot of books teaching the American people once again the same lesson. And I have no doubt that in the next year or two, we will all read bestseller lists for somebody else who will do it again, teaching us about how many poor people are. The point, poverty is with us and stays with us despite the efforts, honest or maybe not so honest, depending on which government is in power, the efforts of people to try to deal with it, by making the market work better, by having the government step in more, or whatever it is. I'd like to offer you another way of looking at it, using the different economic theory than either of the two I've just described, and laying out another way of thinking about it that leads to a different idea of how you solve the problem of poverty, assuming that you're concerned about the problem of poverty, if not for yourself, then for others. And this approach takes its cue from Marx, Karl Marx, and is a way of thinking about economics that I've found very persuasive as I've gone through the American education system. I had to find it interesting on my own since my professors were afraid of going in that direction. I never much admired that about my professors. They were courageous in other areas, but in this area they weren't. So I had to do that on my own. But I found that really rewarding, and so I thought I'd share it a little bit with you. So let's do it in the Marxian way. The way that Marxists begin is they look at the way production is organized. And I'm going to do this in the simplest manner possible, because I don't want to take the whole time that we have just to talk at you, but to have some back and forth. So let me be summary. How does a Marxist understand the relationship of production? What goes on in a job? In a very interesting way that I'm going to describe now. And I'm going to use the following description. Imagine yourself looking for a job, sitting down across the table with a private employer. Or these days, if you work for a big company, for somebody who's in the human resources department, whatever that means. And you and she, or he and you, have a conversation. And it goes something like this. Here's the job we're going to have you do. Here's what you're going to come. And you're going to come at 9 o'clock in the morning. And you're going to stay till 5. And you're going to do this. You're going to do that. You're going to use this equipment. And here's the product that we make. And you listen and you nod because you know that all of this is nice and fun, but you want to get to that other question. How much am I going to get paid? That's the question. So finally you get to it. And after much haggling back and forth, trying to be polite, you and the employer agree on something. let's say, for the sake of enjoyment, it's $20 per hour. You're going to come there 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and you're going to get paid $20 per hour. You're going to do what the employer says when you walk in that door. You're going to do what he says, how he says, with whatever he gives you to work with, to produce whatever it is that he tells you to do with your brains and your muscles over those hours. And at the end of the day, when you've poured your creativity and your muscle power into that job, producing something, he's going to say to you, hopefully politely, okay, go home. And you're going to understand, because you're good students and you've learned this all your life, that you go home, but what you produce stays there. And if you haven't understood that, you try to take some of that with you, people in blue uniforms come and hurt you. So that helps you learn quicker. And I'm sure you don't use that system here at Rollins, but in other places they use that system. But you know, you produce it, but it's not yours. Here's something else you know, but perhaps has never been put into these words before. The employer is going to give you $20 per hour of your effort. What is it you know, even if you never said it to yourself this way? The only reason the employer will ever pay you $20 an hour is if in that hour you produce more than $20 worth of extra stuff that you leave there at the end of the day when you go home, and that's your employer's to sell. The only way you will ever get paid in any job is if you produce more than the person employing you pays you. So for those of you who thought it was your American birthright to get paid what you're worth, it wasn't. And it isn't. And you won't. The difference between what you produce and what you get is why the employer hired you in the first place. You produce more than you get. You are the recipient, and you're on the short end of a hustle. If we had more time, I'd stop now and I'd play the national anthem. But I won't. I'd just like to let it sit in, sink in, and sit there with it for a minute. Why is this important to understanding poverty? Here's why. Because the workers, when they go to work, produce more than they get, then the question has to be asked, well, who gets that extra? What the worker produces then doesn't get. The employer gets that. In Marxian theory, it's called the surplus. It's that extra that he's in business for. Whatever he spends on tools, equipment, raw materials, and workers, he wants to get back more than it cost him to undertake the production. That's why he did it. He doesn't produce chairs because he wants 4,000 chairs to sit on. He produced chairs to make money, more money at the end than he put in at the beginning. The worker is where that extra comes from. The worker who produces more than it costs the employer to have him come there. And guess what the employers do with the extra they get, which they, by the way, like to call profits. Marx called it surplus. They use it to keep this situation going because they're the winners in this arrangement. Because that extra that you produce, more than you get, is not yours, you, of course, can't hire anybody else because you're just getting enough to kind of get by. The extra you produce is somebody else, and they use it to keep themselves in the privileged position. Punchline. The reason the rich get richer is because they get the surplus, which they use to get richer, which is what they're interested in doing. And the reason the mass of people don't is because they don't get the surplus they produce. You as workers don't get the value of your labor in terms of what it can produce. From which the following conclusion flows pretty smoothly. Maybe, we could argue, poverty has never been successfully addressed because those of us interested in it from all persuasions, were either unable or unwilling to look at the situation I just described. We were unwilling to change the organization of production. We were unwilling to ask whether there was any hope of ever eradicating poverty so long as we allowed a situation in which the majority of people go to work and produce a surplus that a tiny minority gather into their hands. Some of you, I know, are believers in democracy. You think that a situation in which we all have to live with the consequences of actions, we should all be able to participate in making those decisions. In politics, we believe we should all participate. But something interesting happens in the way we organize production. When you arrive at 9 o'clock at your employer's, you go in the door and democracy is not around. What you produce, how you produce, where you produce, and what gets done with the surplus you produce, those are all key decisions. You have to live with the results, and you have absolutely no say over what that's about. You accept that in your economic system. It's kind of stunning that you do, but you do. And it may be that we've been unable to solve the problem of poverty because we keep delivering the surplus produced in our enterprises across the economy to a relatively small number of people who, big surprise here, use it to keep themselves in that situation. To make themselves, if possible, richer, as they have been doing in the last 30 years, and everybody else relatively poorer. So now the final conclusion. If you really want to do something about poverty, if that's a commitment you actually take seriously, and indeed if you want to do something about democracy because you take that seriously, then you have to look at the way we organize production. One of Marx's best insights. We don't have to organize it in such a way that the mass of people come and produce a surplus that a completely different group of people get. Most production in the United States, for example, is done in large corporations. These corporations have thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of employees. The people who make the decisions are a board of directors. It's usually 15 or 20 people. They're put into that job by the major shareholders. Likewise, 15 or 20 people. A tiny number of people make all the decisions, and we produce the surplus and deliver it to them. And we're surprised that we don't overcome poverty? Here's a thought, concluding thought, comes right out of the Marxian tradition. Suppose we organize production differently. Suppose instead of having a mass of people who come and produce a surplus for a different group of people who then use it, make all the decisions about what to produce, what to do with that surplus, what to do with the profits, suppose we didn't give it to a different group of people. Suppose the workers in every enterprise made those decisions themselves. Here's how your job might look. Monday to Thursday you come to work, you do your particular task, whatever it was, in that enterprise. Friday you come to work, but you don't do your particular task. You sit around all day in meetings with your fellow workers, deciding together, one person, one vote, what you're going to produce, how you're going to produce it, where you're going to produce it, and what's going to be done with the profits that, after all, your labor produced. You would then be an interesting new kind of person. You wouldn't just be an order taker on the job, you'd be an order giver. You wouldn't just have a function in the division of labor, you'd be part of the governance of the enterprise. Just like your participation in civics is supposed to make you part of the governance of our communities. Guess what? If the workers themselves disposed of the surplus, unlikely they'd give it to a tiny number of themselves and exclude everybody else. It wouldn't last real long. You might be intrigued at some of the other things workers might have done over the last, say, 30 years if they themselves had run the enterprise. They might not have moved the jobs out of the United States to other countries. They might have raised their wages compared to what happened. They might have eliminated poverty for an enormous number of people, or after all, the people all around them. Am I sure it'll work? No. What in the world have we got to lose? The other two approaches haven't worked. Why not give it a shot? And the sheer democracy of it all, of letting people actually have some control over their jobs. Let's remember the job. From the time you become an adult to the time you retire. Well, let me change that in America today. From the time you get your job and become an adult to the time you drop dead, you'll be working. You'll be getting up, go to work, 9 to 5, 5 days out of 7. Your day will be spent getting ready for and traveling to your job and doing your job and then traveling home and recuperating from your job. If democracy is not important to have in the place that occupies most of your adult time, where is it important to have? You really just want to have it for your elections once a year when you go in a little booth and pull a lever? Or do you want it every day in what really matters to you? Those 8 hours, 5 days out of 7. So here's a thought that comes out of the Marxian tradition. If you care about poverty and if you care about democracy, you really have to ask questions about the organization of production, which is what Marx was so interested in. That production of surplus by a majority of people that goes into the hands of a minority of people who use it in ways that doesn't overcome poverty, even when those individuals themselves all say they would like to overcome poverty. It doesn't seem to work out. Last point. If we don't change the way we organize the system of production, then we are not taking an opportunity to try something to overcome poverty. Even though the other economic theories we have, having been applied to that problem for 100 or 200 years, have not been able to solve it. And if I can persuade you to worry at least, that a society in which the gap between rich and poor keeps getting bigger and bigger, which is ours now, may be headed for the kinds of troubles that have afflicted other societies that didn't pay attention as the gap between rich and poor became too big over too many years, then this may not just be an interesting theoretical matter, but an urgent matter for the future of the country you're going to live in for the rest of your lives, and in which you're going to do that working 5 days a week, most of you anyway, and that the conditions of that job will probably affect you. This approach is a Marxian approach. I didn't invent anything I just said. All I did was take some ideas from Marx, really interesting ones, I think, that my teachers were afraid to present to me, learn them on my own with other students, and realize that they have some very interesting insights. Teach us about possibilities that we wouldn't have figured out otherwise. Given us a range of choices as to how to deal with a problem as important as poverty that we wouldn't otherwise get. And if there's anything that's meaningful about the process of education, it's having the opportunity to engage the alternative ways of dealing with problems that beset the society. So I hope you found it interesting to see how another perspective looks at this problem and comes up with an alternative way of solving it that touches some of the most important variables and values we as a society claim to hold dear. Let me stop there, thanking you for your attention. And if anyone has any comments or questions, please throw them at me. Not everybody at once. Sir.
I had a question. When you talked about profits, you talked about that it was taking a surplus labor value, and that's what profits was. But what about the nature of like some people that are rich now that seems to be more like they're buffering from like an idea more so than the exploitation of labor, like the guy who created Facebook or even built exploiting people for surplus labor, or was it really like their ingenuity and an idea that made them rich? Because especially in that industry, it's not really like a labor-intensive industry so much.
Well, it's always, good question, it's always possible to make money in a multiplicity of ways that have nothing to do with exploitation. That's always been true. I'll give you an example. As far back as we know, people have lent money to other people. They made a loan. You read in the Bible, people make loans a long time ago. When you make a loan, something very interesting often happens. You give somebody $100, and the deal is, at the end of a year, they give you back the money you gave them, the principal, the $100, and they give you some more back. We call it interest nowadays. They give you an extra. So here's a way of making money where you're not hiring anybody, not doing any labor, you're just giving them money and they've got to give you some more. And in our Western culture, there's always been a tension about this. You do know, I assume, or if you don't, let me be the first to tell you, that Western culture has agonized over this process. For 1,000 years, the Roman Catholic Church declared that it is a sin to charge and pay interest. For those of you that are Roman Catholic, you ought to think about this. For those of you that aren't, probably a good idea too. It was a sin. You know why? Because in the Catholic theology it said, if another person needs to borrow money, that's a person in need. And a good Christian helps another person in need, and a good Christian doesn't demand of that other person that they give you back more than you gave them, because that's taking advantage of their need, and Jesus wouldn't want that. Powerful argument. People got into big trouble because they charged interest, and the church said, no, you're not going to do that. So you can charge interest and you can make money without exploiting someone. Here's another way you can do it. You should be familiar with this because it's all around you. You can buy something at a price and sell it again at a higher price. You'll make money that way. Your local convenience store does that. The person at the local convenience store buys a big box of potato chip bags. Each one costs him 60 cents. You go in there and you pay $1.25. Hello? What just happened? He shelled out 60 cents for that bag of potato chips, and then he got $1.25 out of you. He made money. Did he exploit you? No. He didn't hire you. You weren't doing any work. You didn't produce any surplus for him. So yeah, there are ways of making money other than exploiting people. There always have been. Here's another one. You produce something, and you create, because of either good luck or your own effort, a lot of desire for it. A lot of desire for it. But then you use your influence with the government, for example, to be able to withhold what you've produced from the public. Everybody wants it, but you're the only one who's got it. Then you exploit workers, maybe you get $10 per worker by exploiting it. But that's chicken droppings. I'm careful. Chicken droppings. What you then do is you charge a lot for something you know people want. It's called cornering the market or monopoly. It's a way of taking advantage of something. So if you're the first one to figure something out, and if you can arrange to prevent other people from replicating what you're doing, you know how we do that in this country, right? Patents, trademarks, you're allowed to go file a paper, and anybody who without your permission does what you do gets thrown in jail. But then you're not making money out of exploiting people particularly. You're making money like a blender is or a merchant is by engaging in another kind of activity which allows you to pull money out of other people. What Marx was interested in, though, was the production part of society. Not the lending part, not the merchant part, not the patent hustle. He was talking about your normal, everyday production arrangement, and there, too, was a way to make money. And that, because that's how we produce the goods and services we all need, was for him the key thing to understand, so that's why he went after it. Yeah?
It would appear as though in this theoretical firm where the workers make the decision that such workers wouldn't decide to have a surplus and use it for trade, and it would, macroeconomically speaking, it would discourage trade and therefore inhibit technological progress.
Why would that be, exactly?
Because the workers wouldn't decide to use the surplus goods and trade with other nations or trade with other people, and then this would discourage technological growth.
I keep wanting to ask you, but rather than ask you, let me just respond. When capitalists start a business and they make a profit, we then have to worry, what does the capitalist do with the profit? The capitalist now gets it, that's the way our system works, and the capitalist, being the owner of that surplus, that profit, will now decide what to do with it. And we could all be afraid, for example, that the capitalist would say, oh great, I got a lot of surplus, see you around, I'm going to the Bahamas. This would be frustrating for the rest of us, because the factory would stop functioning, all the money would have been absconded with, we'd never see our good friend again, and all the 400 people would lose their jobs, and the community would suffer. We don't worry about that, because the capitalist has to figure out that he too will not stay as a capitalist very long if he doesn't keep that business going. He'll have a few good weeks in the Bahamas, and then where will he be? He has to learn that he has to use that surplus to buy inputs from other countries. That's where the trade comes. And the people in other countries aren't going to send him the stuff he needs to produce unless he pays for it with a portion of the profits he gets from his business. If capitalists learn how to function, how to distribute the profits they earn to keep themselves going, here's a piece of hot news. If workers collectively ran enterprises, they'd figure that out too. They would collectively decide what they buy from abroad, how to distribute the profits, to keep themselves as a collective enterprise going, just as the individual capitalist figured out how to keep himself going. The difference is it's not a minority using their surplus of a majority to keep themselves in a privileged position. It's actually the majority governing themselves and deciding collectively what to do with that surplus. But they'd end up with very comparable patterns of exchange and trade and distributing the surplus, not because they're smart or lovely, but because of the self-preservation of this way of organizing enterprises leaves them very little in the way of an option. Yeah?
I know it's kind of like, you talked about it for a couple seconds and said that it had already been done, but do you not find that education itself is the inequality in education perpetuates poverty, like it's a main source? Do you find that just the production, like the organization of production is the main source of poverty, or it's the only source that we haven't like exhausted yet? We haven't really, dealt with.
Yeah, my major point is we haven't dealt with it. It's not that it's the only one, or none of that. I focus on it because other people have ignored it. That's the major reason I focus on it. But let me play with it just for a moment with you. Part of the reason we have a highly unusual education system in the United States is, again, heavily rooted in this system. If you create, well, let me do it a different way and tell you a story. My family is French. My father was born in France. I grew up speaking French, and it's part of my personal history. And I go to France a lot. And when I go to France, I remember one of the first times I went, I asked questions about the university system there. And the answer I got threw me as an American because I wasn't ready for it. There are no private universities, basically, in France. Everybody goes to a public university. And when you ask them, why is that? They look at you as if you're strange, and they say, well, if we had a private and a public, it would be a two-track system. It would be inherently unequal. People with money would go to the fancy private ones, and everybody else would go, and that's undemocratic. They looked at me as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. This led me to more questions. One of my favorite questions, which blew me away even more than education, was when I asked them about holidays. How many holidays do you get at your job? And they giggled again, and they said to me, oh, you're not familiar with French law. I said, no, what's the French law? I said, the French law is, the minute you go to work, you get 5 weeks of paid vacation. That's the law. I can see from your faces, I can get a good charge out of telling you this again. From the day you start working, you get 5 weeks of paid vacation. Most of you will not get 5 weeks of paid vacation after 20 years on the job. At this point, I should play the national anthem again. Why is that? Well, it has something to do with the organization of production. Here in the United States, we have about 15 million people that go to colleges and universities right now. Less than 3 million out of the 15 million go to private school. 12+ million go to public school. The education of our people in this country at the higher level, college and universities, is overwhelmingly an activity of the government, and has been for the last half century. But we tend, not always, but we tend to send the more affluent folks to the private schools, and they tend to have conditions that public schools do not have. And that has something to do with the desire of those at the top of the economic system, those who gather the surplus into their hands, to have reserved places for themselves. And you all know that. So don't look at me funny. I'm just the messenger. And I'm now telling you something you already know. You know which part of town those folks live in. Just like you know which universities they go to, and what clothing stores they shop in, and what kind of car they drive. Whether you're of that group or not, you know. You all know. All that Marx wants you to do is sort of face what you know. So yeah, my answer to your question is, I want to look at the organization of production on the chance that, because others haven't looked at it to solve the problem of poverty, and because the other approaches didn't solve the problem, let's give this one a look, see whether the changes there could make, not just for the eradication of poverty, but for solving a whole host of other social problems that have likewise resisted opposition. And if what I told you about France is interesting to you, you should be aware that many of the countries in Europe that are our closest allies would not accept the social conditions for working people that Americans take for granted. In Germany, there's a law. If the enterprise has more than 2,000 workers in it, the board of directors has to be 1/2 workers. Are you aware of this? That's the law. That's the law. In Germany, if a company wants to leave where it is, just close the business, move to another country to be able to hire workers at lower pay, which is a major sport in the United States. If they want to do that in Germany, they have to get the permission of the local community and of the trade union. And by the way, the argument in Germany is real simple. The local community will be devastated if that company leaves. The local workers in the trade union will be devastated if they lose their jobs. They have to have some role in this decision. Can't let a small number of people make a decision that impacts many without allowing the many to have a participation. Because if you did, that wouldn't be democratic. If the thought never occurred to you, then that's a defect of your education. Not your fault. But it doesn't say much about what you've been taught. Okay. Others? Thoughts? Comments? Questions?
Isn't that system that you're suggesting about, like, all the workers making decisions together, like an egalitarian society, which has happened already, where everybody does their own part, then tries to make a decision which died out because it didn't work?
Gee, I wish I knew about it. Where was this?
Oh yeah, I thought that's how it was, like...
No.
Okay.
All through history, people have been intrigued by this idea. It is not a new idea. Here in the United States, for example, we've had, and we still have, people who do something called co-ops. If you look into what co-ops are, cooperatives, it turns out that people all through American history have thought it would be a much better way to exist and live in the working part of your life to work in a collective, cooperative way. Your faces suggest it might be useful for me to give you some examples. So let me. From the United States today. The area where we have our most impressive high-tech industry in the United States is a place called Silicon Valley. It's a strip of the California countryside between San Francisco at the north and San Jose at the south, between the San Francisco Bay and the ocean. Very pretty part of the country. And there are concentrated a huge number of our computer and high-tech industries. For the last 50, 60 years, something interesting has happened there every year. Every year, engineers, well paid, people earning $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 or more, quit their jobs. They work for IBM or Cisco Systems or any of those monster companies, Oracle. They quit, walk away. And together with 20, 30 other men and women, they collect their laptops and they go to somebody's garage and they set up a little enterprise. And they love this. Instead of wearing a tie and a jacket, they wear Hawaiian shirts and loose-fitting Bermuda shorts. They bring along a dog, a toddler, and a frisbee. They are high as a kite most of the time. They have a wonderful time. And here's how they organize their enterprise. We're not going to work the way we did. We're not going to have some dumb boss telling us what to do with our computers. We're not going to come to work in a tie and a jacket like some penguin. Here, everybody's equal. Here we're going to, this may sound familiar to you, you know where I got my example from before. Here we're going to work Monday through Thursday on our laptops, making our software programs, or whatever it is they do. On Friday, we come in a little higher than the other days, and we spend the day having meetings, figuring out what we're going to produce, how we're going to produce, where we're going to produce, and what we're going to do with the profits of the business we're in together. They love that. Here's what those engineers said. We hated our life in that big company. We didn't like going to work. We didn't like taking the orders. We were not productive because we were unhappy in that kind of way of living. And now we love it, and it's not just because we're high. We like this way of working. We're much more productive. Here's what those guys did in the language of what I presented to you. They walked away from a capitalist organization of enterprise. And instead they created a collective enterprise. And they didn't do it because they had taken a course from me, poor folk. They hadn't had that pleasure yet. They didn't do it because they'd ever heard of Karl Marx. Most of these guys, and I've talked to them, are Republicans. When I explained to them that what they were doing was right out of Karl Marx, they found that strange. But that's a comment on their education, too. When I said Marx, half of them, I think, thought I meant the guy whose first name was Groucho. But they were doing it. They were setting up this kind of enterprise. And they like to point out the following, that many of the most important breakthroughs in computer technology of the last 50 years that are routinely spoken of as though they reflected the power of American capitalism didn't reflect anything of the sort. They reflected the power of people who hated the capitalist organization of enterprise and specifically organized a radically different one because it made them more productive in their life and in their work. Here's another group of people who walked away from a capitalist enterprise, or in some of their cases, never went anywhere near one. They're the men and women of religious orders. You know, the folks, for example, who make that interesting kind of jam and jelly. Here's how they work. They go out there and they grow the strawberries all together, and then they harvest the strawberries all together, and then they pack them in the little jars, and they put the labels on the jars, and they do that Monday through Thursday, and Friday all the nuns get together and decide what to do, how to produce the jellies, and where to produce the jellies, and what to do with the profits to help their order in the Roman Catholic Church. There's nobody telling them what to do. There is no boss. There is no enterprise run by a capitalist. None of it. Neither with those folks with their laptops in the garage, or the nuns making jam. So there have been people all around the world, all through history, who have been interested in this kind of way. But what we've never had is a society that was able to learn those lessons and put it all together to create an economic system composed of enterprises that worked this way. But again, the question, if we did, would that enable us to have a different quality of life, as well as a different quality of work, than what we take for granted now? And if you haven't thought about this, that's a defect of your education. You should have. It's an option. People have been thinking and doing it, and as I just gave you examples, they're thinking and doing it now, and giving powerful reasons why you ought to pay attention and see this as something not just to solve the social problem of poverty, but something immediately relevant to your own life and the future laid out before you. Let me get at it one other way, by a little piece of American history. One of the things that made the United States unique over the history of our country was the fact from around the 1820s or 30s to the 1970s, about 150 years, bulk of our history as a country, real wages kept going up. Real wages simply means the amount of money workers got adjusted for the prices they had to pay for the things they bought with their wages. So how much stuff an average working person could consume. It went up for 150 years. Amazing. No other capitalist country that I know of delivered that kind of performance to its working class. Made the United States unique. Notice I'm using the past tense of the verbs. Made us unique. It brought us immigrants from every corner of the world because they figured they might do better here than where they came from. And they were mostly right. And the reason for that is not hard to figure out. Capitalism was very successful here. Capitalists made a lot of money. But they were constantly short of workers. You know, the folks we found here, we couldn't use them as workers because we killed them. And it's very hard to use them after that. So they weren't around. We solved part of the problem by bringing large numbers of a certain group of people here who didn't want to come. For the rest, we counted on bringing people here by making it worth their while. High wages. And then the poor capitalists discovered it didn't only have to have high wages in America to bring people here, but as soon as people got here, they wanted to run to the West, where they could be farmers and get cheap land from the government. So an employer had to pay high wages to get a worker here, and then they had to keep raising the wages to keep the worker from running away. So wages kept rising in America for 150 years. And the poor American working class began to believe, with the help of preachers, that this wasn't a rising real wage because of how capitalism worked with labor shortages, but had to do with the fact that God really liked us best. We were a special place, the U.S. of A. That's why every president has to say to the people after the end of his speech that this is the greatest country on earth. If you worked in an office with a person who told you he was the greatest person in the office, you'd hate his guts. But we actually came to believe it as a nation. We're a very special place. Very special place. Imagine how difficult it must be for the American people, that's you, most of them, if that stops, as it did in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the long history of rising wages in America stopped. Here's what happened. Oh, footnote, just so you know. Real wages, that's the amount of money you earn adjusted for the prices you pay. The average real wage in the United States today is exactly what it was in 1978. There's been no increase per hour of work in the United States. That hasn't sunk in to most Americans, which is why your faces are giving away that it's news to you too. But it is the case. Why did that happen? Computers meant we don't need so many people. Companies leaving the United States meant we don't need so many people here. We need them somewhere else. Immigration came in, and women decided to go to work because they didn't want to be homemakers anymore the way they had before. You put all those together, and our wages stopped rising. That was a wonderful thing for every employer. Every employer was making money hand over fist because the productivity of workers, what the worker produced, because our workers were better educated and they worked harder. For the last 30 years, what the worker produces for the employer per hour went up. But what the employer paid the worker didn't. And so, what did the employers do with that? They used it to become very wealthy. One of the things that employers did starting in the 1970s, just to give you an idea, is they took all this money they were earning as the workers kept delivering more and more to them, but they didn't pay the workers anymore because they didn't have to. They didn't have to. And employers who don't have to pay their workers more have learned in business school not to do it. So the employers became much wealthier. One of the first things they did is they turned around and started paying the top managers astronomical bonuses. Huge salaries. The American people became aware of that 2 years ago in the depths of the crisis, when we were very outraged as a nation of these enormous bonuses that they get on Wall Street. I'm glad the American people got angry 30 years late. It's been going on a long time. That's why we have the gap between the rich and the poor. Because we have a system that delivers this surplus to a small number of people who decided to use it to pay themselves spectacular salaries. Here's another thing they decided to do with the money, the surplus, the profits. To move production out of the United States to make still more profits. Many of you are aware that we are dependent in this country on goods from China. Most of you are wearing outfits from China. If I wouldn't get into trouble here, I'd have a little experiment right now. I'd say, you know, every one of you please take off all your clothes. See if some of you are perking up already. And on one side of the room, I want you to put those that were made in China, and the other side of the room, put them made anywhere else. And then we'd see, as each of you came up to deposit your clothes, we'd see, those of you that would be looking, that the pile was larger over here from China than over there from everywhere else. What you may not know with this flood of stuff coming from China is that roughly 60% of the goods from China are made in enterprises in China that are subsidiaries of American corporations. They went over there because it makes more money to produce with a cheap Chinese worker and ship it back to the United States than to produce it in Alabama or Pennsylvania or California. They used the profits we were producing for them in this country to make even more profits by producing elsewhere. If the workers themselves had run the factories, guess what would not have happened in the 1970s? They wouldn't have stopped raising their own wages, and they wouldn't have moved the jobs to China. And our country's history would be completely different from what it is now. That's why it's worth thinking about this as an option. That's why it's worth understanding that Marx's insight in this case leads you down a path of thought that might really solve some of our problems, rather than using mechanisms of approaching those problems that have not worked for 200 years. Other comments? Questions? Yeah.
How does workers go about starting their own worker-run corporation? Because you still have to have some capital to start that.
Yeah.
So is it like a collective capital that would start this, or would it be like one person you would kind of have somebody start it and then they would get paid back and then just join in regularly? Because at that point it would look like that they would just stay on top.
Right, could be. But let's look at it. Where would the capital, paraphrase, where would the capital come from to enable a group of workers? And let's assume, to make your question, point your question a little more sharply. Let's assume that these were your average workers and they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have the wherewithal to do this. But suppose we, just hypothetically, heaven's sake, take this seriously, hypothetically, let's say we wanted to create such enterprises. How could we get enterprises going that there isn't enough capital in the hands of those people to do it? Well, rather than beat ourselves about the head and come up with a new idea, here's a thought. Let's take some ideas already part of American history and just use them again. 30, 40 years ago, we had a problem in the United States. And the problem was, we believed as a nation that there weren't enough, quote-unquote, minority-owned businesses in the United States. That mostly meant, in those days anyway, the African-American community, and that there weren't enough businesses that African-Americans had, and it would be hard for them to get going, here comes the question, because they didn't have the money. Geniuses figured out, here's a thought, the government, they said, could provide the seed money, the initial capital, maybe as a long-term loan on advantageous low-interest loan basis, to let specifically earmarked for minority-owned businesses to help them get off the ground. And we did that. And you know where the minority community got the idea? From an even older idea in America. If you ever take the time, Google the following. SBA, Small Business Administration. Here in the United States, we thought a century ago that it would be important to help small businesses. Why did we feel that? Because the big ones were swallowing up all the little ones, which they have a tendency to do, nasties as they are. So we set up a government agency that helps small businesses, gives them capital on advantageous terms so they can make it. So here's a brain-busting thought. If we believe that American working people ought to have freedom of choice, what do I mean? Well, freedom of choice is something Americans rank right up there with apple pie, saluting the flag, and other fun things. So if you want freedom of choice, you ought to have the choice between working in a top-down capitalist enterprise, choose that if you want, or this other kind of cooperative democratic enterprise. You ought to have the choice. You don't have much of a choice now because the second kind isn't around. So the government could do what it did for small businesses and minority-owned businesses, but this time it would be called the Democratic Enterprise Program. So if a bunch of workers want to get together and set up an enterprise, they go, fill out a form, show they have a business plan, and get the capital to start that way. That would be a way of doing it. It might surprise you to know that in many of the 50 states of the United States, that already exists, what I just described. There are specialized funds to provide, the word in most U.S. states is called community enterprise, which I thought always was an interesting choice of words, because community has, of course, the same root as the word communism. But don't let that worry you. It's a community enterprise, so we'll call it that. And there, for example, the state of Connecticut has a special fund that a group of people can set up collectively, a community enterprise, can be sponsored by a church or a fraternal association in the community, and then there's state money, as well as federal money, that is available to help them get going so that they can become a viable enterprise. So if the will were there to do it, if the idea that American working people should have a choice, if that actually took hold, then the government could help develop the kinds of enterprises that would allow each of you to decide by yourself as an individual whether you would like to work in this kind of enterprise or in that kind. And I think you and I both know that if Americans in large numbers had such freedom of choice, which way they might choose to go. And that maybe is why they don't have that choice. Precisely because of what choice they might make. And that means that all of us should have the courage to demand the freedom of choice that doesn't now exist, that it be established so you could do that. Yet another reason to go in this direction, besides trying to solve the problem of poverty, and besides trying to extend the concept of democracy to the economy and not just our political life, here's another one, to give people the freedom of choice as to where they spend the bulk of their working lives across an entire lifetime. Any other? No faculty folks have any questions? Okay. I hope it has been interesting, and I hope that you take advantage, as I hope you've come to understand that you have an unusual department here in Rollins. I wish when I had gone to college I had a faculty as diverse and as open to options as this one here. I really do envy you. On the other hand, it's a wonderful opportunity that you have. Thank you very much.